Lawyers of Reddit. What was your craziest oh shit moment in court? Story 1. I was representing a plaintiff in a hit-and-run case. Plaintiff is testifying and is, despite me preparing them for several hours the previous day, an absolute terrible witness for her own case. Like she couldn't even identify the street she was crossing when she was hit by the car. It was a major highway, and we had gone through the sequence of events countless times the day before the hearing. The oh shit moment came during cross-examination. Defense counsel pulls out a picture of my client dressed up and ready to hit the club, which was posted to Facebook the day after the alleged accident. I, thinking quickly, object because the timestamp refers to when it was posted, not when it was taken. Defense counsel show the picture to my client and asked her when the picture was taken. Sure enough, they say it was taken the day after the accident, when she was supposedly in unbearable pain. To be honest, it's not your fault. Good thing it happened too as well. Justice was served that day. Story 2. I was a baby lawyer in my first year representing the 19-year-old child of some rich people in San Mateo County, California. My client had gone on a bit of a shoplifting spree, and we were cleaning all her cases up with a global plea, meaning we handled them all at once. Being new, I filed out the plea form wrong, swapping the counts she was charged with for the counts she was pleading to. It's an easy mistake to make. Every court has their own unique form, and I was unfamiliar with San Mateo's. The judge calls my line, starts reading off the plea form, notices the mistake, and then starts screaming at the top of his lungs. "Counsel, what is this? Is this your first day on the job? This is a court of law, and we do not accept mistakes. Fill this plea form out correctly, or I'll have you taken into custody for contempt." I did not expect a reaction like that. My client, who had clearly just taken a huge bong rip at 8 a.m. and who was wearing an all-pink velvet tracksuit, was looking at me like I was the biggest idiot in the world. I corrected the plea form. The judge made me wait until the very end of the calendar to take my plea. Afterward, he called me up to the bench. In private, he told me, "Sorry to ream you like that. Everyone messes the plea form up, so I always pick the youngest lawyer to yell at. The older guys will grumble and complain. But if you notice, they all fixed their own forms, and we didn't have any more problems. Keeps the calendar running smooth. Where did you go to law school?" After that, he invited me into his office for coffee and gave me some really good life and work advice. Turns out he likes talking to new lawyers. Story 3. Literally the first thing I ever did was just a law student intern. Guy has a legit defense on a possession case. Drugs found in a jacket. Guy wasn't wearing a jacket. They were going to have a very difficult time proving the jacket belonged to my guy. Had a long meeting with the client, and I've explained everything about what he should and shouldn't do, blah blah. Day of the preliminary hearing, Guy shows up and sits down directly in front of the officer who arrested him while wearing, guess what? The jacket in question. The exact same jacket we were going to say they couldn't prove belonged to him. Oh man, that's absolutely wild. It's like something straight out of a TV show, but way more hilarious and cringeworthy. The fact that your client wore the exact jacket in question to court is just mind-blowing. I guess sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. As a law student myself, I can only imagine how frustrating that must have been. And it's a good warning for me to always expect the unexpected. Story 4. I was just interning in court during law school, but I'm a lawyer now. Fight in a club. Someone had broken someone else's jaw and had 6 friends with him that insisted he had been identified wrongly because he never had a beard, and the victim said he had a beard. They used a very specific phrasing to the tune of, "My friend doesn't have facial hair because he is a professional in the food industry, and it would go against the regulations." After 3 of the witnesses had repeated the same exact phrasing, the judge stopped one to ask if he knew what a couple of terms in that line meant, and the witness couldn't explain it. Defense lawyer got busted for instructing the witnesses. She'd also gotten the defendant to reject a plea deal that exchanged prison time for a fine and community service. Story 5. My ex-mother-in-law was a crazy Me and my wife at the time had cut her off almost completely. Every once in a while, she would give in and let her mom visit, which always turned out badly. Eventually, we got divorced and I got full custody. Mother-in-law went nuts and decided to sue me for custody. I looked over the law, and for any form of visitation or custody, you need to have had contact in the last 6 months, and she hadn't seen them for over a year. So we go to court. I can't afford a lawyer, but the law was pretty clear. She goes through 3 lawyers. Each of them quit in turn. So she finally winds up representing herself. During the last hearing, she was talking to the judge and said something to the effect of, "I don't want to get custody of them. I just want to be able to visit." The judge then asked her point blank, "This is a custody hearing. Are you telling me you no longer want to get custody?" She said yes, and the judge dismissed the case immediately. Oh wow, this story is comedy gold. I can picture your ex-mother-in-law fumbling through the court proceedings like a sitcom character. Her pursuit of custody must have been exhausting, but I've got to admit, it's hilarious that she torpedoed her own case right in front of the judge. Talk about a plot twist. The fact that she went through 3 lawyers before representing herself is the icing on the cake. They say the quickest way to lose a case is to be your own lawyer, and she sure proved that right. Story 6. I have another one that I've just remembered. Representing a guy accused of housebreaking, managed to persuade the prosecutor that they couldn't prove it, so they dropped the case at the intermediate diet, procedural hearing, before the case called in court. Headed downstairs to the cells to break the good news to my client, who was remanded in custody. Have an idle glance at the details of the charge while I'm waiting for the cells staff to bring him out. The house that was broken into was my then next-door neighbor. Client was delighted that he was getting out. Him, "Aw, cheers, pal. You're the man. Cannot wait to get out." Me, "No bother. Right. See that place you definitely didn't break into? I live next door, so can you leave my house and car alone, please?" Him, "For sure, man. The boys go up there stealing all the time. What car'd you drive?" I told him what kind of car it was. Needless to say, my car was broken into about 3 weeks later. Story 7. I was the defendant, representing a nonprofit that I volunteered for. The plaintiff was a 60-something grandma who was looking for a retirement settlement after falling out of her jacked-up pickup truck in our parking lot. The premise of her case was that our parking lot was in bad shape. It was. And that she fell into a pothole and broke her leg, which resulted in her having to take Coumadin and diminished her enjoyment of salads at the Friday night fish fry. No, really. It was going along fine until my lawyer put up a photo of the pothole, taken the day of the incident, filled to the brim with water after a recent rain. He asked the lady if she had gotten her foot wet, to which she replied that she couldn't recall. He talked a little more about how perhaps if her foot wasn't wet, it might have been because she fell out of the truck and didn't really fall into the pothole. He asked again if her foot was wet, and she affirmed that, yes, her foot was wet. The moment came when he went back to his desk, flipped through her deposition, and read the part where she was extremely adamant that her foot wasn't wet. Then he did some fancy legal stuff. The case was thrown out, and I went back to work. Wow, the fact that your lawyer managed to expose the inconsistency in her testimony with the wet foot question is pure genius. I can just imagine the collective gasps in the courtroom as he read the deposition, and the plaintiff's face turning as red as a tomato when she realized she'd been caught in her own lie. This story is the perfect example of how the truth will always prevail, and sometimes in the most entertaining way possible. I'm glad the case was thrown out, and I hope your nonprofit continues to do great work. Story 8. So I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a forensic case manager for an alternative to incarceration program. Basically, our program accepts clients who have severe mental illness, and instead of going to jail, they're mandated to mental health or substance abuse treatment instead. And my job is to follow them throughout the mandate and be the point person for the court and their therapists. We go to court with them and talk with their lawyers and judge and provide a psychological evaluation. I have many, many stories and only been here about a year. This one guy we had to stop working with, even though we initially accepted him into our program. He was eligible for inpatient residential treatment because he was very sick and a violence risk. We referred him to places and got a call from one saying they interviewed him, but they were rejecting him. When asked to describe himself, he laughed and said, "I'm the murdering type." Yeah, residential facilities don't like hearing that, bud. Story 9. I was representing my client during a sentencing for some petty burglary. The judge asked him if he had anything to say before he imposed sentence. My client started, "Your Honor, I just want to apologize." I'm thinking he's going to apologize for the burglary like they always do. But he continued, "This morning I tried to bring a knife into the courtroom, and it was frickin' out on record before I could stop him. There was no way for me to strike it from the record, and my client is a frickin' idiot." Story 10. This was told to me by a legendary trial lawyer in my area. I probably have some of the details wrong, but here's the gist. It was a personal injury case against the manufacturer of an industrial fan. It was supposed to be child-safe, but a kid got their fingers chopped off. The manufacturer was claiming that the plaintiff was only injured because the fan had been modified from its original condition. The defense lawyers had been an exemplar fan that was straight from the manufacturer. They brought in an expert and on direct had him explain how it would be impossible for this kid or anyone else to hurt themselves. The idea was that the guard mechanism would have prevented people's fingers from getting too close to the blades. He was a well-qualified witness and gave very compelling testimony on direct exam. Unbeknownst to the defense lawyers or judge, the plaintiff lawyer had brought a very long extension cord and plugged in the perfectly safe fan. On cross-exam, he went over the expert's theories and had him say unequivocally that it is impossible for someone to injure their fingers on this fan if it is unmodified. The plaintiff lawyer then walked all the way across the courtroom, turned on the fan as high as it would go, and began walking it towards the expert. It was loud, so he had to kind of shout over it. He definitely had the jury's full attention. He gets right up to the witness and starts in on him, still half yelling due to the noise. "Show us! Stick your fingers in!" "No! Come on, stick your fingers in! I don't want to do that!" The other side is jumping up to object, but the plaintiff lawyer is 2 inches from the expert, yelling for him to stick his fingers in. The expert is looking terrified and shrinking away from the fan. The jury came back in favor of the plaintiff. It's my favorite example of show, don't tell. Jeez, I can just picture the entire courtroom holding their breath as the plaintiff lawyer wheels the fan across the room, shouting over the noise while challenging the expert to put his fingers in. The expert's terrified reaction must have been priceless. Talk about an epic show don't tell moment. It's amazing how a single, well-executed move can turn the tide of a trial. Kudos to that lawyer for thinking outside the box and standing up for the injured kid. Story 11. Not my story, but while getting on the elevator banks at the courthouse, another lawyer tried to hold the door with his foot and his shoe popped off and went up with the elevator. In this courthouse, there are probably 20 elevators, so there was no way he was going to find that shoe in time for his court call. He freaked out for about 10 seconds and then said, "I guess I'm going to court with one shoe on," and got on a different elevator. Haha. Story 12. A famous high-profile case in my community had an incredible moment. A high-profile guy's house was raided, and they found a few shreds of evidence in the ashtray and other scraps in the toilet. In court, he was asked if he ever burned evidence. He said no. When asked if he ever flushed evidence, this older man, without the best memory of 2 minutes ago, responded, "No, if I wanted to get rid of evidence, I would burn it in my ashtray." Guess who won the case? Story 13. Sitting in court, doing some plea paperwork with a defense attorney for a go-home plea agreement, where a person is released from custody and doesn't have to do jail time, we hear this to our left, and we look to see his guy sitting in the galley all by himself, sitting in the cloud of the biggest vape pit I have ever seen. Then has the audacity to tell the judge it went off in his hand. Needless to say, he lost the case. Oh, geez, the mental image of everyone turning to see this dude sitting in a giant cloud of vape in a courtroom is just too funny. And then the piss-poor excuse that it just went off in his hand. I mean, come on, dude. What planet are you from to make you think that's gonna work? I would love to hear what was going through the judge's mind when he saw that. Not surprised for a second that the guy lost the case, but at least he got to play the part of the court jester for everyone, I guess. Story 14. Sat in on a personal injury case where the plaintiff broke their leg in an accident and had a doctor on the stand as an expert. The woman's lawyer begins questioning the doctor about their experience with leg injuries. He was a well-known orthopedic surgeon in the area. She asks if he's ever treated a tibia fracture. The leg bones are tibia and fibula, to which he only answers no. Then she starts grilling him with questions about the tibia. After about 6 or 7 questions, she asks, "How did you get a medical license and have been able to practice medicine this long if you've never treated a tibia fracture?" And begins a small rant about going after his credentials and those that gave it to him, to which he simply responds, "There is no bone named the tibia." The lawyer became beet red, and everyone in the room tried their best to keep from laughing, including the judge. Story 15. represented a woman charged with multiple very serious felonies. She'd been seriously dating one of the detectives, who ultimately wound up investigating and testifying in her case. For a variety of reasons, I trusted this client and believed her, even though the detective never disclosed the relationship in his report. So during his testimony, I asked, "Detective Smith, you had a romantic relationship with Miss Defendant, correct?" He goes, "What? No," and is visibly offended. The judge looks at me like I've lost my mind. The Commonwealth attorney audibly says, "What?" I'm freaking out because a large part of my cross and argument was focused on the bias formed by the prior relationship. And now I've got nothing, and I've lost all credibility. I try again. "Detective Smith, have you had a sexual relationship with Miss Defendant?" As the Commonwealth rises to object and the judge starts to scold me, the detective goes, "Oh, yeah, we've had. It just wasn't very romantic." Edit/update. State is Virginia. The jury acquitted my client of the relatively minor charge that the detective in my story was involved with, but convicted of the other, much more serious charges that detective had nothing to do with. There was a confession and video on the serious charges, so it was kind of a no-brainer. Sorry I'm being kind of intentionally vague. There are no confidentiality concerns, since this all happened in open court, but it's distasteful to give out too much information about a client. The detective was not disqualified, his testimony was not thrown out. Impeachment, no matter how good, doesn't result in you getting to throw out a witness's testimony entirely. By the way, it wasn't really the that was the issue, it was that he didn't disclose it to anyone, and his repeated insistence under questioning that he didn't disclose it because it was irrelevant. Like Watergate, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up that gets you. But I don't get to demand the judge throw out the testimony or that charge just because the cop failed to disclose a prior relationship with the defendant. I just get to point it out, argue it in closing, and then hope the jury also sees the relevance. Oh wow, this story's a wild ride from start to finish. Love that the detective didn't admit to having any relationship with the defendant just because the sex wasn't romantic enough for him. Ouch. Sorry, Miss Defendant. Gotta up your game, I guess. Story 16. It was just another day in the life of a lawyer, and I was confident as ever representing my client, Mr. Thompson, in a seemingly mundane property dispute case. Little did I know, this day would forever be etched in my memory as the most bizarre experience of my legal career. As I was presenting my case, I noticed the opposing counsel, a man in his mid-40s with a smug grin, repeatedly glancing at his watch. His anxiety was palpable, and it only added to the suspense in the air. I began to wonder, what was he hiding? We were about halfway through my argument when the doors of the courtroom swung open, and a man in a disheveled suit burst in. The courtroom was filled with gasps and hushed whispers as the man stumbled towards the judge's bench. He was drenched in sweat, and his eyes were wild with a combination of terror and relief. "Your Honor," he panted, "I have urgent information that will change the course of this trial." The judge, visibly agitated, motioned for him to approach. He handed over an envelope, which the judge carefully opened and began to read its contents. As the words on the paper sank in, the judge's eyes widened, and he muttered an audible, "Oh." My heart pounded in anticipation. I could feel the tension in the room reach its peak, and everyone held their breath as they waited for the judge to speak. "This new evidence," the judge began, "has been authenticated by forensic experts, and it reveals that the entire property dispute was based on a forgery." He paused, then continued. "I have no choice but to rule in favor of Mr. Thompson." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The opposing counsel stared at the floor. His smugness evaporated. As for me, I was in utter disbelief. I had won the case, but it was the wildest turn of events I had ever experienced in my career. Story 17. Not a lawyer, but I got in enough trouble in my teens to know what a judge does and doesn't like. Uncles/father decide they're going to conserve my grandmother and put her in a secured perimeter memory facility. In reality, they just wanted to pee away her $20 million estate. We end up in court with our lawyers. One thing I know about most judges in courtrooms, they want to be revered like a church. No talk back, no talking out of turn, wear a suit, even if it's a $20 Goodwill suit. Father, uncles all show up. All of them spend about an hour bad-mouthing me. I'm keeping my mouth shut, looking at my feet. One of my uncles tries to examine me. I just keep my mouth shut until the judge tells him he's not a lawyer and I'm not examination. None of them are well-dressed, sneakers, dirty sweatpants. My uncle, who's the ringleader, decides to start talking over his own lawyers. My lawyer makes some comment. The judge starts talking to her, and my uncle's lawyer says something like, "Now hold on, ladies." All they had to do was keep their mouths shut and not tell their lawyers how to do their job, and they could have won. They pretty much handed Grandma and I the win. It's hilarious how your uncle tried to examine you and how the judge then shut him down. And that comment from your uncle's lawyer? Yikes, I can only imagine the judge's reaction to such disrespect. It's incredible how they were basically shooting themselves in the foot by their continuous chattering and essentially handed you and your grandma the win. Story 18. Step-parent adoption I was handling in law school. I was appearing before the court on a motion, literally just submitting a written brief and summing up my argument so the judge could think about it in chambers for a few weeks, when the judge stopped me halfway through my explanation of the motion, said, "I'm ready to sign the final order," and executed it right there at the bench. The client happened to come along for this one and broke down happy crying before we left the courtroom. Story 19. Corporate lawyer, but took on a pro bono immigration matter, helping a victim of domestic get her immigration status sorted out. She had been in the country for 20 years, originally legally, but not anymore. It took us multiple months to get a hearing scheduled. We've spent hours in U.S. Customs and Immigration Services offices by this point. Her situation is somewhat precarious, and we need to resolve this. She told me a few weeks before the hearing that she needed to reschedule because she was going to be out of the country. She said her daughter was going through a high-risk pregnancy and would be giving birth during that time. And my client was the only caregiver/available family for her daughter. That's fine. We put together a letter, get a note from the daughter's doctor about the medical necessity, etc. USCIS gives us a hard time about it, but ultimately, hearing is rescheduled. My client and her other daughter come to the rescheduled hearing. Client gets asked about recent trips out of the country. Well, I went on a vacation to my home country last month. Instant cringe. She's in the U.S. illegally, and it's unclear whether or not she should have been traveling on the passport she was. I jumped in and tried to clean it up for her, and thankfully the USCIS official was more interested in moving us through the system than getting hung up on past issues. However, she was within an inch of this all collapsing around her and getting kicked out of the country. Please leave your story down below in the comments. I would absolutely love to make a video about them in the future. And also don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, peace.